Hey, it's Phil here, your host for Under the Crossbones and the Ship's Chimney Sweep, getting those ship's chimneys all ready for Santa Claus to come down and eat some cookies, leave some presents for the crew. There's got to be somebody left on the good list, the nice list, and not everybody's on the naughty list. Anyway, thank you very much, so much for tuning into Under the Crossbones all this year. I really, really do appreciate it. I hope your end of the year and your holidays, whatever you're celebrating or not celebrating, it doesn't matter to me. We can all just take a break this time of year and eat some food and appreciate each other. And that's what I'm doing for you here today. So what we're going to do is I'm going to play for you the most popular episode of 2018. We'll replay that. And that is with Ann Chambers. Talking about Grace O'Malley. She's the foremost expert on Grace O'Malley, the Irish Pirate Queen. And this is an episode from back in March, right around St. Patrick's Day, because it appeared like I was thinking and putting things together in the order they should go in. So we're going to hear about that in a second. And if you want to know what the top 5 round out to be for the year, the second place episode was Samuel Marquis, the author of Blackbeard, Birth of America. Number 3 was Marcus Rediker, author of Villains of All Nations. 4th place was Dave Burgess of Teach Like a Pirate. And in 5th place was Bill Fernie with the author of Blackheart's White Bones. And so that was it. You guys like your authors, apparently. And I know we have a lot of authors on this show, but it's a lot of fun. So that's what's coming up. I'm not going to do a bunch of ads and stuff today. We're just going to dig right into it. You know all the websites, underthecrossbones.com, Facebook / Under the Crossbones, all that kind of good stuff. All right, let's just get into it. Ann Chambers is here. She is the world's foremost expert on Grace O'Malley, the Irish Pirate Queen, and we're going to dig into how she got into the subject, how she has expanded on the subject. Her first book on Grace came out in 1980, which is amazing, and she's been writing and touring and doing all sorts of stuff around Grace O'Malley and her family and the history around that subject since then. She has an amazing body of work, and so we're going to dig into that. We're going to dig into Grace's place in Irish history. I started to sound like Sean Connery all of a sudden, who's not Irish, he's Scottish. And we're going to get into that. So we're going to talk some history stuff. We're going to talk about why the term pirate may not be the most accurate thing for Grace O'Malley. But it's a great, great interview. You're really going to dig this one. It's a lot of fun. All right, we're going to get into this. Are you ready? Get your Irish in your voice, put on something green, and we're going to talk about Grace O'Malley with the author, Ann Chambers. Check it out. A large body of work. And was the Grace O'Malley book, The Pirate Queen, was that your first book that came out?
Yes, I'm afraid I have to blame Grace O'Malley for changing my life from a banking career into a biographer. And yes, I was working in the Central Bank of Ireland here in Dublin, and I was always interested in Grace O'Malley because when I went to school, she never appeared in the pages of her history books. So we all here in Ireland back then thought that, well, did she really exist? Was she just myth and legend? Nobody had ever done anything about her. She had been airbrushed out of history. And I was speaking to somebody one day, and I was saying that someday I must look and see was there any factual evidence about Grace O'Malley. And that person said to me very directly, why someday? Why don't you do it now? So 4 years later, a trawl through very, very difficult 500-year-old manuscripts, which were mainly held in British archives because Ireland was beginning to become under the influence of England during Grace O'Malley's time. So consequently, without the Elizabethan state papers, I wouldn't be talking to you today, Phil, about the factual story about Grace O'Malley. It was actually the English state papers that preserved some of the records about her factual life. Now, the rest, her memory in Ireland was preserved by folklore, and we cannot dismiss folklore, and we dare not dismiss folklore. And indeed, during the course of my research, I was absolutely amazed how often folklore and the factual research coincided.
Really? Oh, that's interesting. So how prevalent was she in Irish folklore? Was it something that was common knowledge, almost a pop culture figure, or was she kind of sort of pushed off to the side where she was just kind of this weird character from the past, or how much did she figure into Irish culture?
Well, she was used over the generations when Ireland, the word Ireland was prohibited by the British for being used in poetry. We're a great nation of poets here. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes in the struggle for independence, which, as you know, went on for over 500 years here, indeed since the time of Grace O'Malley, the word Ireland was often banned. So the poets of Ireland would take a figure from the legendary past, like Gráinne Mhaol, that's how she's known in Ireland, Grace O'Malley, and they made poems about her, but she was really being a symbolic for Ireland, for Ireland's struggle. So you had the poets saying, that poor old Gráinne Mhaol, poor old Grace O'Malley needs these warriors to come and rescue her. So the English hadn't a clue about this, so all these things were published, but in effect the poets were talking about Ireland. So Grace O'Malley became synonymous with the struggle for Irish freedom, although she herself would have a long, hard, big laugh about that if she was around today, because you cannot put a green flag at all around Grace O'Malley. Grace O'Malley is a product of her time, which was a tribal community, rather like what the first Europeans found in your country, the Native American tribes. We had something similar here in a clan culture where the O'Malleys were one tribe, you had the O'Flahertys another tribe, the Burkes another tribe, each tribe often fighting one amongst the other over things like perhaps dowries for women, perhaps cattle rustling, land division. And that was how the English in the end took advantage, the old military way of divide and conquer. So Grace O'Malley really was a product of her time. Her fight wasn't necessarily for Ireland. It was for the survival of herself, her army, her family, and then in a wider context for the clan system which bred and bore her.
That's really interesting. So her lifetime and her work is taking place at the very point where England is starting to encroach on Ireland then, is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
And to come back to piracy, as you know today in places like Somalia, when you have a breakdown of the political, cultural and indeed religious organizations in a country, piracy becomes very prevalent because people are forced off the land and they're forced to seek an alternative for their very survival. Grace O'Malley was born into a seafaring clan, one of the 40 or 50 clans of Ireland that I spoke of. Now, the O'Malleys were very different to all the other clans. Ireland, although an island, produced very few seafaring families of note, and the O'Malley clan was a big exception. So consequently, if Grace O'Malley had been a boy or a man, I would never have written her biography. You wouldn't be interviewing me today because she would be simply another O'Malley doing what came naturally.
I see, okay.
The fact that she was a woman, the sea is a great barrier to women. Even today, very, very few women, you'll never hear women saying, if you ask children in the classroom, what would you like to be? Very few of them will say a sailor or a fisherman or something to do with the sea.
Sure.
It's still a barrier today. And you can imagine what it was like in the 16th century. Firstly, there was a superstition that a woman on board ship was called the devil's ballast.
Uh-huh.
A woman at the helm was unheard of. The sea physically was a very demanding environment for a woman from a physical point of view. And thirdly, to be in command of men at sea by a woman was, and still is to a great degree today, still unusual. So Grace O'Malley is an iconic figure in that regard, and she's quite unique in that regard. And I think it's that seafaring aspect of her that contributed to her being banned or airbrushed from history. Because past generations of historians here in Ireland, particularly, wanted their women to conform to a certain, I suppose, lesson that they were preaching. They had to be maybe ultra-Roman Catholic. They had to be very, very good and faithful wives. They had to be, known for their charitable good works. Well, now none of these things apply to Grace O'Malley. Firstly, she ruled her husbands. Secondly, she chose her own husband. Thirdly, she was very successful in her career. Otherwise, her 200 men would not have followed her if she hadn't been successful, and she was. And what's lovely about Grace O'Malley, I think, is, and what is almost empowering for women today, and don't forget that she's a great headline act for women today, because Grace O'Malley never had to jettison her femininity or her sexual orientation in order to compete in a man's environment. Grace O'Malley was a daughter. She was a wife twice over. She was a widow twice over. She was a divorcee. She was a lover. She was a grandmother. She was a matriarch. So, Phil, she goes through the whole gamut of the female role.
That's really intriguing. And it's intriguing that the same thing that makes her stand out as a historical figure is the same thing that got her erased from the historical context. That's
from a male interpretation of history. And, you can see where they were coming from. A lot of them were religious, and she didn't really fit into the identikit that they wanted for women to follow. Sure. And that's why she was airbrushed out. So I was very happy to have. And I don't know why it wasn't done, that it was left to me to really write her back into history. And now the children going to school here, and indeed in your own country, I get thousands of letters and emails every year about her, and I'm so thrilled about that, is from young students who are doing projects on her, who are looking at her as a historical figure, and I hope being an inspiration to them as she was to me.
Where does she acquire the name the Pirate Queen? She comes from a seafaring family, but a lot of the fighting she did was on land. Did she actually engage in piracy in the traditional way that we think of it, but from more of a freedom fighter angle?
Well, see, piracy in any maritime community, you have to be very careful where that is. Wherever it is in the South China Sea or in Cornwall or on the west coast of Ireland, if you're involved in the maritime way of life, a little bit of piracy and plunder was always part and parcel of that. Now, it was nothing like Pirates of the Caribbean.
Certainly.
And I hope to goodness that nobody over in Hollywood will ever do a story of Grace O'Malley and make it into, the Annie Oakley of the west of Ireland or Pirates of the Atlantic Ocean, because that would be a terrific injustice to her. Uh-huh. Her family were, for 2,000 years, the O'Malleys, going back to the old prehistoric records here, the O'Malleys are mentioned always in connection with the sea. They sailed as far afield down to Spain. They sailed to the west coast of France, sailed up to Scotland, and of course all around the coast of Ireland. They were mainly traders, and they traded the clan produce far afield, because otherwise they would have to pay taxes in the cities here, because the cities in Ireland were always controlled by the English administration, who imposed high taxes on the native Irish from doing business there. Okay. So consequently, people like the O'Malleys took their clan produce and other clans and sold them. Now, what were these clan produce? Well, there were things like barrels of salted fish. There were skins, hides, tallow made from the bones of cattle. So you had all of that great trading going on with Europe, and the O'Malleys were part of that. Now, that was one side of their business. The other side was, if you look at the maps of Ireland, at that period, you wouldn't recognize Ireland. Map making was only in its infancy, and very few people had been to the west coast of Ireland. It was as remote to a lot of people, and hence the Spanish Armada, as you know, in 1588. Mm-hmm. How many ships were wrecked off the west coast of Ireland. It was as unknown as the west coast of America. So consequently, the O'Malleys acted as pilots for ships going up along the west coast of Ireland from Spain and France up to Scotland and elsewhere. That was another side. The third part of their business was, because of the disturbed political state of Ireland with all these inter-clan feuding, there's one thing that they always say in America, which amazes me, is the fighting Irish. Do you know, we never fought at all. We got other people to do our fighting for us. Because At that time, you imported the mercenary soldiers from Scotland, from the Highlands and Isles of Scotland, and they were called the Redshanks.
Okay.
And O'Malley ships brought them in for the fighting season, which went from May until October. They were brought in, they fought for a particular chieftain for that season, and they were brought back again after being paid back to Scotland. Now, another chieftain whom they may have fought against the previous season might hire them the next year to fight somebody else. And again, it was the O'Malley ships that brought them in. So it was a very lucrative business for the O'Malleys, and they're mentioned on this, and indeed some of their ships were wrecked off the coast of Scotland many, many times, and it's mentioned in all the old annals of these shipwrecks when they were bringing in the Redshanks or the Scottish mercenaries in to fight in Ireland. So you can see with that came then the flotsam and jetsam of the sea, and you had a little bit of piracy and plunder. If a ship got into difficulty or was forced into difficulty, well, the O'Malleys weren't behind the wall and taking what was there.
Did the O'Malleys see themselves as more of a neutral territory because of they were bringing everybody's soldiers in, or were they taking sides?
Simply business.
Okay.
Pure and simple, a business venture, and it wouldn't matter to them who was fighting who. They were the shippers. They were the in-between people who were bringing in these fighters into whatever chieftain was prepared to pay them to bring them in and pay the mercenaries to fight for them. So it was just merely a business venture, and it was a very lucrative. And then we had a very, very lucrative fishery off the coast of Ireland. And there's an old Grace O'Malley's father actually issued fishing licenses to fleets from England, Spain and France to fish in his sea domain. The O'Malley looked on the sea off the west coast of Ireland, particularly off the Mayo-Galway coastline, as their territory. And if people banned them from trading in towns, well, they imposed a fine or a toll on people who wished to fish their waters. And Grace O'Malley took that a step further, because she started imposing tolls on ships, on English ships that used O'Malley Sea territory, and made quite an amount of money during her life doing that.
That's interesting. So what do you think her motivations were then in fighting against the English incursion? Was it simply to maintain business? Was it to maintain her family? Was it to maintain the clan system? What benefit do you think she saw in fighting off the English?
One word: survival.
Okay.
When you think of what's happening in Syria and the Middle East and places like that, where an entire civilization is under attack, where the social fabric, the family fabric, the business, land, everything is under attack. That was happening in Ireland, particularly in the latter half of the 16th century, when Grace O'Malley comes into her power. And when you have that, you have total trauma on land. The sea, in a way, is the savior. This is the highway not only to new cultures, to new lands, to new trading ports, to new everything, but it's also your savior when your enemy doesn't have the same power on land, and that's around sea. And that is how Grace O'Malley stayed alive throughout her very long career. I don't know, actually, it's amazing how she lived to have achieved old age in this very, very traumatic time.
Yeah.
The English feared Ireland always as a back door by their European enemies. And that's exactly what happened in the 16th century when the King of Spain, who wanted Queen Elizabeth off her throne, on 3 separate occasions made incursions into Ireland. So Elizabeth knew that in order to protect her own kingdom of England and to keep herself on the throne, she had to rule Ireland as well. That was one reason. The second reason is the 16th century is the era or the century of exploration. You know, Virginia was discovered by Walter Raleigh. It's a great era of adventure, of exploration. How easy was it for these adventurers from England just to jump over the Irish Sea rather than the wild Atlantic Ocean to America, to carve out estates from Ireland's beautiful pasture lands, her primal forests, lakes. You had a fortune in land, in sea, in lake, in river, teeming with fish here. You had these great primeval forests for their wood. And that's exactly what happened. In the van of the military invasion of Ireland came all of these carpetbaggers who carved out estates for themselves at the expense of the Gaelic chieftains. So Grace O'Malley finds herself up against that. You're having these invaders coming in, looking at the lands of the chieftains and saying, what title have you to that land by English law? And the chieftains say, well, we've inherited that through Irish law. And the answer to that is English law is now in. So you have a huge trauma and a traumatic period of history in which this remarkable woman has to try, firstly, to save herself and her family. Then it widens out to save all her followers. And finally, really, she is, when all the chieftains have fallen in the various rebellions and wars, it is Grace O'Malley who's left to hold it all together towards the last decade of the 16th century. And that is when she decides to make the most perilous journey she ever did, and that was to meet her perceived enemy, Queen Elizabeth I in London.
When she went to meet Queen Elizabeth, did she know that it was to be pardoned, or did she think it was for negotiation?
Well, the highlight of my research, Phil, was when I found the letter by Queen Elizabeth to say that Grace O'Malley had come to court to see her in Greenwich in July 1593. Now, that was one of the legends always about Grace O'Malley, that she met Queen Elizabeth and that she was a young woman and she met this strong Queen of England and she banged on the door of Greenwich Palace and said, I am the Queen of the West and I must see the Queen of England. Of course it didn't happen like that. It happened far more interestingly. There were old women when they met. They had a lifetime of experience behind them, dealing with on the political level, on the military level, and they had a lot in common, including all the wrinkles on their faces. And they sat down and they did a deal. Now, the reason Grace O'Malley went was what every woman on the planet will understand. She went to save the life of her youngest son, Theobald Burke, Tibbet na Long, the first Lord Mayo, whose biography indeed I wrote as well, because he's left a lot of letters behind him. There was nobody she could appeal. He was taken up by the English authorities on a trumped-up charge of treason, which meant death by hanging. That was the outcome of treason in that time. And Grace O'Malley had nobody to appeal to. The whole of Ireland now was in upheaval as the English were beginning to gain the upper hand here and the chieftains were being fought to a standstill into a corner. And she knew that there was nobody, but she knew about Elizabeth. She was so au fait with the political happenings at the time. She knew she could offer Elizabeth something if Elizabeth allowed her son go free. And she sailed herself to London. But she didn't go willy-nilly, because if her ship had been caught, she was a known rebel at this stage. She had led 3 rebellions, not necessarily against Elizabeth, but against her governor, Bingham, in her province of Connaught. She had also now established herself as a pirate because she had plundered some English ships, some Spanish ships. She didn't really it didn't really matter to her, whatever came near. And that had all been sent to the court in London to say that this woman was both a rebel and a pirate, and that meant the Tower of London, basically.
Sure.
So Grace O'Malley did not go willy-nilly to the court. Firstly, she found that the Queen's cousin, the Earl of Ormond, who was an Irish nobleman, with whom Grace O'Malley had done business before in the importation of wine, I found she got from him a letter of protection and introduction to the court. And I found that note among the manuscripts. And she goes armed with that. And once she has that, she's under protection. She's under the protection of the powerful Earl of Ormond, who is a cousin of Queen Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn. And anybody who was connected to Queen Elizabeth's mother got a very warm reception at court.
Huh.
Elizabeth always carried this memory of her dead mother with her right until the very end, as you know, of her death. She clutched really a little cameo of her mother as she died. So the Earl of Ormond was a favourite with the Queen. So Grace O'Malley is around the court. You can't get to see the Queen of England in 1593 no more than you can get to the Queen of England today in 2018.
Right.
You know? So you have to wait your chance. Thousands of people wanted to see her, to present her with various petitions. So I found that the Queen's Secretary, Lord Burleigh, asked Grace O'Malley to literally fill in a form. So Grace O'Malley actually has bequeathed us a potted autobiography of her own life. Now, mind you, her answers to his 18 questions, he asked her 18 questions, are very, very guarded and very shrewd. She knows what to say and what not to say. She, after all, is in the lion's lair at this stage. So when she fills up this form, which I found in the manuscripts, Lord Burleigh, the famous Lord Burleigh, became intrigued with her. And this wonderful statesman who was with Queen Elizabeth, her advisor for nearly 50 years, is now an old man himself. And I found one of the Grace O'Malley's letters to him. And he starts to doodle. You could imagine in candlelight in the palace in Greenwich, and he tries to work out all her complicated family because she was married twice and she had two families. She had a family with each husband. And it's a lovely little personal that this great man is doodling how Grace O'Malley is connected to this one and that one and the other. And in the end, anyway, he suggests to Queen Elizabeth that she should see this woman. And that's how they met.
That's incredible. And so she went there to make a deal, essentially. How well did Queen Elizabeth know her background, or was she just sort of, when he said Grace O'Malley is here, did she go, oh, it's that criminal, or did she know something else about her?
Oh, she knew all about her because Bingham, the governor, has sent every negative thing he could find about Grace O'Malley is sent in his letters to the court. He's telling the Queen she should throw her into the Tower of London, that she's a rebel from her childhood. He calls her a nurse to all the rebellions in Ireland for 40 years. I love this word, the nurse to all rebellions. You can imagine her nursing these rebellions. And, he really sends a very, very negative report about her. But the Queen was intrigued with her. Here was another woman in a man's world, rather like Elizabeth herself. Uh-huh. They were, in a way, sister spirits. And you can see that from the letter that Queen Elizabeth wrote. She released her son. She said that Grace O'Malley promised that she would fight with the Queen's struggle with all the world. Well, now that was given a very wide interpretation once Grace O'Malley got back to the west coast of Ireland, I can tell you. But what I find intriguing of all is, in 1601, just before Queen Elizabeth died, a new map of Ireland was drawn for her by a famous Italian map maker called Battista Boazio. And it lists all the chieftains of Ireland and all the lords of Ireland. And over County Mayo on the west coast of Ireland, the only woman ever mentioned on a map as a leader, and there it is, Grace O'Malley.
And what year was that? What year is that map made?
1601. 1601, the map was printed. But you see, she made such an impact in London with her audience with the Queen. The map was being designed at that time, and her name was actually included in it. The only woman I know in any map around the world, I've never seen a woman's name listed as a leader in a political leader at that time.
Interesting. And that was still within her lifetime because she didn't pass until 1603, if I'm remembering right.
1603. The last entry in the state papers is about Grace O'Malley in 1597, and she's 67 years. Now, that doesn't sound a lot today, hopefully. In the 16th century, the average life expectancy of a woman was around 35.
Sure.
This woman had gone through wars, storms, squalls, childbirth, husbands, lovers. My goodness me, she'd gone through everything and she was still alive. She was still alive, and that age was nearly equivalent to 95.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Amazing. And the last entry in the state papers is very, very appropriate, that they're saying that Grace O'Malley led an attack on O'Neill of the island of Barra off the coast of Scotland because he had attacked her people earlier. So she's still connected with the sea, and that is the last entry. She dies out. She dies out as she came into factual history, a little bit obscure. We have her certainly alive in 1601, and I think. Well, tradition states she's buried on Clare Island, which is a lovely island on the mouth of this beautiful bay called Clew Bay, with its 300 islands, and that's where Grace O'Malley lived and operated from. And again, when I say all of these islands, that protected her as well. Anybody who knows the sea, and seafaring, to have all of these almost an archipelago of islands that you can hide. Your enemies don't know it. There's no map to show them. There are the sands, there are the shallows, there are rocky outcrops that they don't know anything about. So consequently, she was sheltered there for many, many decades. And she's buried on Clare Island in a lovely tomb in the abbey there. Very appropriate resting place for a pirate queen.
Interesting. And I imagine you've been able to visit that?
My goodness, I lead so many people there, Phil. I've been at this now for the last 35 years with Grace O'Malley. I've written lots of books, but the one on Grace O'Malley is, it really is the one that has caught the imagination.
Yeah, I'm sure. What do you think that people misunderstand about Grace O'Malley, either in Irish culture or general worldwide culture?
Well, I think the word pirate is very misleading, although we all use it, and she's gone down in history as the Pirate Queen of Ireland. But, I mean, it is a little bit misleading in view of what we think of piracy. And you have to explain piracy as part and parcel of seafaring life, no matter where one was. As I said, in the South China Sea or in Cornwall or in the west coast of Ireland at the time, it was always part and parcel of maritime life. Now, the fact that she was a woman brought more notoriety to something that her family had been doing for generations. And I don't like that. Secondly, I find she was used as a national figurehead here in Ireland, which is totally at odds with the period of history in which she lived. She's her own woman. She's an independent, iconic woman, a mold breaker. She was called by one of the English officials here the woman who overstepped the part of womanhood. I'm not quite sure what the part of womanhood is anymore, but I mean, she certainly is different. And in this day and age of Me Too, gender imbalancing, and all of that, she is really a great figurehead. She's documented, she lived, she acted the way she did for reasons that most women can understand, to protect herself, to protect her family, and to survive. It all comes down to that basic survival instinct that is in everybody, and it certainly was in Grace O'Malley. The fact that a survival instinct blossomed out into a kind of a nationalistic, thing. In the end, she had to meet her perceived enemy in Elizabeth, and it was Elizabeth who saved her son. So it's not all as black and white. And when I find that, that she's been used that way, I feel, you're detracting a bit from her, I'd be a little bit protective about her now that I've found her and kind of restored her back to history. And, I've been trying, as you possibly know, to get a biopic television drama, which I've just finished the first draft now, and it's sent off. And I've tried to deal with the psychology of this woman because it's very interesting, why she did this, how come she did that, was she true to herself? Was there something within her that propelled her into this very, very dangerous Machiavellian life? She's a very, very astute politician. She knew everything that was happening in Europe. The fact that she lived out in a remote area in the west coast of Ireland, as you know, Phil, from dealing with this, the sea to her was a highway, whereas to us landlubbers, it would have been looked on as an obstacle.
Sure.
But the sea always was a highway to the O'Malleys, to new cultures. Grace O'Malley spoke English, she spoke Spanish, because she had contact with these places. The fact that the fiction would say that she spoke in Latin to the Queen, she didn't need to. She understood it. I have all the letters of the people who met her. Nobody ever said she needed a translator to talk to Grace O'Malley. She spoke English. She spoke Spanish. So she's a woman of the world, really, in many respects. And I think the fact that she was domiciled in a remote area doesn't necessarily mean at all that she wasn't in contact with what was happening in the wider European context.
Certainly, yeah. And when you sat down to begin this process of writing this book, what was your intent behind it? Was it truly to just educate yourself on it, or were you trying to return her to Irish consciousness or worldwide consciousness?
Well, firstly, I just did it for myself. As I said, I had a banking career here at the time, and I did the book, the first version or the first edition of the book. I just did off for my own information because I was fascinated by her, and I was wondering why, if she did exist, why was she airbrushed from history? Mm-hmm. Surely we need, 50% of civilization seems to be obliterated at any one time. What were the women doing in all of this? They all couldn't be knitting, and just doing this. So there's somebody like Grace O'Malley always comes up, but the fact that Grace O'Malley in the sea, that's what sets her apart from other powerful women, including Queen Elizabeth I. She could rightly say to Queen Elizabeth I, you call yourself the mistress of the seas, but you've never sailed downriver further than Greenwich. Uh-huh. You could call yourself commander of the army, but you never led the army in the field of battle like Grace O'Malley did. So you have a very unusual woman here, and the fact that she doesn't fit into any kind of niche, that people wish to put her in, led to her being airbrushed. So my reason for writing it first was, firstly for myself, then when I saw what I found, and all of this information, it took me 4 years to read these old manuscripts because it was like learning another language. Firstly, the English of the period, they wrote it differently. S's, F's, H's are all made much different or written differently than we do them today. And the language was very Shakespearean in its context and how it was written. So I often think that Shakespeare, all he was doing was really recording what he heard around him, because judging by what was written, it is quite Shakespearean. So I had to come to terms with all of that. There were some documents in Latin as well that had to be done, some in Irish, in the Irish language. So it did take all of that time. So when I had found the real Grace O'Malley, I said, gosh, this has to be brought to a wider readership. And a publisher looked at it and said, gosh, I have to publish that. So it was published in the first edition came out in 1980, and it has never been out of print since.
That's great. And when you went into this, 1979, 1980, we have no internet yet. The idea of researching something like that has to be a rather daunting task, especially not coming from a background of doing historical research. You were coming from banking. What was your first step? How did you decide which direction to go to find out that information?
Well, I arrived up at the National Library here and said, "Can you show me somebody who can help me with 16th century manuscripts?" And the person just looked me up and down and said, "My dear, you do that yourself." So that was my first introduction. So I took off from there. So all my free time and my holidays and everything, it took about 4 years to put it all together. And I just got drawn into it. In order to write a biography about anybody, no matter what period of history, you have to become part of that time yourself. You have to imagine, you have to feel the waves, you have to feel the cold, you have to eat that terrible food aboard ship, you have to feel the time your child is born on board ship, what it must have been like, that lack of hygiene even, all of these basic human feelings. You have to bring that to bear on what you're writing, and you have to be there with her. You can't be looking back at her, from a high plane back 400 years and looking. You have to get back there with her and become part of the adventure, become part of the life. And I think if you do that, you'll connect. You'll get in there under her skin and you'll become part of her life and know what it must have been like, or try and know what it must have been like to survive in these very, very difficult times. And I mean, there were terrible times. There's a romantic side about them, but really when you scrape away all of that varnish, really, you come to the really very basic, terrible life that it was. And this woman rose above it, really, and just, I suppose, rose above it because she had to rise above it.
That level of research, it always seems very daunting to me, but fascinating at the same time to be able to find some of the letter from Queen Elizabeth and things like that. When you happen upon something like that, what goes through your mind except for, outside of this is going to be great for the book, what kind of connection do you feel to a document that old?
Oh, gosh. You feel so excited, really. It's a treasure hunt. It's one little clue leading you on, and you don't know where you're going with it. I've gone up so many cul-de-sacs, and then maybe 5 cul-de-sacs, and suddenly the road just opens up and you see, oh my God, or this fits in with what I've already, and you're putting all these pieces together, and the jigsaw is all beginning to come, and you might be missing a piece here, and you go down another cul-de-sac, and then maybe suddenly there's the light at the end of the tunnel, and you go through a whole gamut of emotions, really, from sheer despair to exhilaration, really. And it's like a sea voyage, really, on a very, very briny ocean. Let's put it that way. So you have the ups and downs on it, and you feel a great sense. You're not doing it either. If you're doing it for money, I think you're not there. You're not at the races, really.
Sure.
I did this for myself, firstly. It was only when a publisher read it and said, I have to publish it, it dawned on me that perhaps other people might like to read this. And then it just took off from there, and it became really almost a life's journey now at this stage. But it gave me such satisfaction. And, there's very few things in life now that money can't buy. And one of them is that sheer satisfaction you get of feeling that you have done something that perhaps will live on after you. And you've done something that, to rectify a wrong, really, she was airbrushed out. She shouldn't have been. And thankfully now she's back in the mainstream where she belongs. So that is great, and it means more than anything. And the fact that she's now a historical, factual figure in the school's curricula, that's where I started all of this. She didn't appear in my history books, but she does now in the modern-day children's history books on the 2 levels here, and indeed in other places around the world. And that's a great sense of satisfaction, I have to say.
Yeah, I'm sure that absolutely would be. So what after that drove you to writing more books? Since originally it was for your own satisfaction and curiosity, what drove you onto the next book, and how do you choose your figures that you're going to write biographies of?
Everything I've done, really, Phil, has been through Grace O'Malley. And when I was writing her biography, I came upon this son that she went to, whose life she went to Queen Elizabeth to save. And that was her youngest son by her second husband, with the unfortunate name of Theobald Burke. He's known in Irish history as Thibaud na Long, Toby of the ships. And he was born aboard her ship on the high seas. And unlike his mother, actually, he left a huge collection of manuscripts behind him that were letters and legal documents and all kinds of things. He became a very wealthy man here in Ireland. He was a very big landowner, and he was one of the few Irish chieftains that managed to hold on to his lands when all these, as I told you earlier, these English undertakers came to take the lands of the chieftains after Grace O'Malley's death. Mm-hmm. And he was one of the big exceptions. And the fact, I think, that his mother had done a deal with Queen Elizabeth helped him a lot, because he became knighted and he became the first Viscount Mayo in 1627. Now, Thibaut Nalong left an awful lot of letters behind them, and they were held in a private collection here. They'd never seen the light of day since the authors put quill to parchment until 450 years later, I was given access to them.
Wow.
So it was a very exciting book to write based on all of these manuscripts. And after that, then my writing career took off after that, and 10 biographies later. So blame Grace O'Malley.
I'm sure you can blame Grace O'Malley for a lot of things.
I think so. But, she's like my alter ego at this stage now, because every year there's something happening with her, something being done, and that's all marvellous. And, we've had a great journey together, and anything I have done for her, she's more than repaid me.
Certainly. Do you see elements of yourself in her or elements of her in you?
No. I think someone said, what would happen if you ever met Grace O'Malley? I said, I'd possibly run to the other side of the road and avoid her. She mightn't be very happy. She might say, I've forgotten to say this about her, or I shouldn't have said the other about her. I don't think so. I think she's kind of up there, She still has that iconic feel to her. You couldn't imagine yourself doing what she did, really. I wouldn't be as brave or as daring as she is, I'm afraid. I'd be far more, I suppose, feet on the ground rather than feet on the deck.
Okay. One of the other books on your website that I noticed that struck me as interesting was the one called At Arm's Length. Can you tell me a little bit about that one?
Well, At Arm's Length was, again, it came out of all of this. During my research for various books, I found here that we in Ireland, after Ireland became independent in 1922, our old aristocracy, the Republican parties here didn't really know what to do with them. They were a throwback to the old British system, although some of them go right back, because don't forget, Grace O'Malley is from Gaelic aristocracy. She is the daughter of a chieftain. She's not an ordinary person. That indeed helped to elevate her to the position she attained. And a lot of these old chieftains, over succeeding generations, their descendants took the side of Britain, because Britain was the name of the game at the time. The British Empire was huge, and to get anywhere in life, Ireland really had to be part of Britain. When we got our independence in 1922, what to do with these old ascendancy, as they were called? And there were really, as one of them told me himself, and he was the 32nd great-grandson of the famous Irish king Brian Boru. And Conor O'Brien could tell me that he felt at arm's length in his own country. And I thought that was very sad. Here was I with the name of Chambers, not a very Irish name, and yet I only looked on myself as 100% Irish. And yet the 32nd great-grandson in descent of an Irish high king could tell me he felt at arm's length in his own country. And that got me thinking. So I interviewed one from each of the various peerages here in Ireland. I started with the Gaelic chieftains, a descendant from one of the Gaelic chieftains, on through the various Elizabethan, Cromwellian, Jacobin, right up to the I think the last of them were created about 1918, Lord Killannon. And I interviewed their descendants, who are now living and working in the Republic of Ireland, to see how they felt about an aristocracy now in a republic. And it's not as strange as you may think, because France, one of the original republic of all of the world really, still today nurses its old aristocracy. In Italy, another republic, you have thousands of people with titles. So in Ireland, and all of these people in France and Italy have a very, very important role to play in the governorship of the country, in banking, in the army. You know, they're not kept at arm's length like we have kept our aristocracy. So I wanted to investigate that. So that book was very, very, it opened, I think it made a lot of people think here in Ireland, that book. And I was very happy to have written it, and it really covers 2,000 years of history, I suppose, in around 400 pages. So I suppose it was some undertaking. But I felt I was filling a niche there that hadn't been looked at before. People kind of kept away from that subject because they didn't really know how to address it. But it was lovely to have the descendants of the old aristocracy to actually interview, and I put some very, severe questions to them, wondering how come their ancestors didn't head up the national movement here in Ireland. You know, why weren't they the leaders of the national movement to break away from England, and
Sure.
why did they change their religion, and why did they send their children abroad for education, and all of these difficult questions, and each one of them answered and introduced new topics, so it became a very, very interesting discourse with them, and I must say I learned a lot about my own sense of nationality from that book.
That's amazing, and kind of leads into the last thing I want to ask you about. You were on the TV show Who Do You Think You Are, which I think is such a cool show. What did you learn about your own family on that show?
Well, now I was helping John Hurt, the late John Hurt, great John Hurt, the actor, and he was claiming descent from Grace O'Malley's family.
Ah.
Now, I just had a new book out just before Christmas, and it's called The Great Leviathan, and it's Grace O'Malley's. You see, I can't get away from her. Her eighth great-grandson in descent was the Marquess of Sligo from Westport House, which was an original O'Malley castle in the time of Grace O'Malley. Uh-huh. And he became very famous in Jamaica as emancipator of the slaves, which is total at odds with his dignity as a Marquess of the realm, as a Governor General. He took the side of the slaves in Jamaica, and he was extremely interesting guy. And that is, in a way, how my journey with Grace O'Malley now has almost, I suppose, it's closure on it, because this biography came out before Christmas, and I don't think I'll be doing biographies for a while again. They're very, very time consuming, and this one took me 6 years to do. Wow. So it was a long haul. So you kind of have to say, well, I want to do some other things rather than living vicariously through the lives of other people, you know.
Time to get a little Ann Chambers in there, right?
I think it's a bit time for Ann Chambers time. Yes, it is.
And so what are you working on for your next project?
Well, my next project, I'm just doing a little bit of family history now. It's just for the family. It's my family's connection with the War of Independence here that we spoke about now for 1924. I'm doing a little bit of that. And I'm also doing a play on aging and ageism and society's attitude. And guess who I'm choosing as the two talking heads on it? Queen Elizabeth I and the one and only Grace O'Malley.
Of course.
I want to examine that whole concept of aging and ageism through their lives. So we're talking heads, rather like a Beckett kind of play. So it's been part of it has been shown being put on a stage in Westport in I think it's in June. So we're going to do a little bit of it down there and see how it goes.
Fantastic. That's really great. So where is the best place online for people to keep up with what you're doing?
Well, now my website is, I'll just give you one guess, www.graceomalley.com.
Okay, got it.
And they can. I'd love to hear from everybody. I get so many societies and women's groups in America. I'm so delighted. They use her as an inspiration, which I'm sure she is, and a lot of self-help groups for women. And I'm so happy with all of that. And indeed, you know, your own side of things from the piracy thing, where I'm not, you know, it's great that she gets her say in that as well, and that it perhaps makes everybody look a little differently, maybe at piracy, that it is a symptom of something else, exactly as it was for Grace O'Malley.
Certainly, yeah, and that's been a running theme on the show certainly for the last year. There's been a lot of new academic studies into piracy, and even people like Blackbeard and things like that, and showing that there is an underlying factor there, and they weren't just a bunch of bad dudes.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Well, Anne, this has been fantastic. I'm going to make sure to link up your website and get all the books and everything in the show notes there. And thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I appreciate it.
Well, lovely to talk to you, Phil, and do keep in touch.
I absolutely will. I'll talk to you again soon.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Right, bye-bye. And there it is, friends. That is my interview with Anne Chambers about Grace O'Malley, the pirate queen from Ireland. And I really enjoyed that. I didn't know that much about Grace O'Malley beforehand, and that was a killer crash course on her history. Really cool stuff. So to find out more about Anne Chambers and her books and Grace O'Malley and all that kind of good stuff, go to graceomalley.com. That's graceomalley.com. And Anne's got tons of books, more than the ones that we talked about during our discussion. There's a lot of really great stuff there that I know you're going to enjoy if you want to find out more.